Thank you all for being here today, and thank you to the Autism Science Foundation for not only funding my work, but inviting me to be here today to present to you. I've had a great day so far, and hopefully we can keep that going here. So my presentation will be about understanding the female protective effect. And there are 4 key questions that I plan to address in this presentation, which are, what is the female protective effect? Why do we think it exists? Why does it matter? And how can we find out what causes it? Now, the first point that needs to be made in any discussion of the female protective effect is that autism is more prevalent in males than in females. Approximately 3 to 5 times as many males have an autism diagnosis as females do. And this is an incredibly consistent feature of the disorder. So the plot that you can see on this slide is showing you the male to female ratio identified in a number of studies of autism prevalence. And you can see that across the board, every single one of these studies has a male to female ratio of greater than 1, meaning that they all find a greater number of males with autism diagnoses than females. And the exact ratio does vary, you can see that here, but it seems to be converging between 3 and 5 males for every female. Now, before I go on, I'd like to acknowledge that there are a growing number of voices in the community who recently have been calling into question the magnitude of this male bias and even the existence of this male bias. And that's because of something really interesting, which is that there is a growing appreciation that autism may look a bit different in girls. Symptoms may present themselves in a different way in females that is just different enough from males, or just different enough from what we expect when we look to give an autism diagnosis, that some of these women may not be being diagnosed. Or they're diagnosed later in life, and so on. So there's a growing interest and a growing body of work trying to look at these differences in symptoms between males and females, and there's some evidence, for example, that girls might show fewer or different restricted interests than males, or they use different socialization strategies. But to really give this topic its due would require an additional full presentation all into its own. So I will acknowledge that point, but leave you with this, which is that when we look harder to find those individuals who might be missing diagnosis through the typical channels, we do find more females with autism than before, but still fewer than males. So this is a similar plot to one that I just showed you. The studies on the top use somewhat typical methodology where they're looking at existing records from education systems, health systems, and counting up the number of autistic cases they find there, and the sex ratio for those studies is, again, between 3 and 5 to 1. The studies on the bottom use a more brute force population screening approach where they go in and screen everyone in a population to try to find autism cases in a less biased way. For example, instead of going into only special education classrooms and counting up the number of kids that you see there with autism, they would screen everyone in an entire school. And this approach, like I said, does find more girls than before, but still fewer than boys. So this screening approach seems to be converging on a male to female ratio of about 2 to 1, which is still a substantial bias. Now, anytime we have a difference in prevalence of a condition between 2 groups, there are 2 main mechanisms that we consider as potentially being responsible. And I'll illustrate this here with these 2 balances or scales to represent the 2 populations that have been exposed to risk factors that we know are associated with autism. For example, genetic variation, complications at birth, that begin to tip those scales toward an autism phenotype and diagnosis. Now, perhaps there's something about being male that exacerbates or amplifies the impact of those risk factors in males, such that it tips the scale even further toward an autism diagnosis. It's also possible that there's something about being female that protects against the impact of these risk factors and prevents them from having their full effect in females. It is also possible that both of these mechanisms are operating at the same time. These are not mutually exclusive. And in fact, at the current state of our research, risk or sensitization in males and protection are really just different sides of the same coin. You can imagine how the absence of a risk factor could appear to be protective, or the absence of a protective factor could appear to increase risk. And I know this talk is about the female protective effect. That's the term that we use, which might imply that we've settled on protection as the key mechanism. But to be fair, we have not yet ruled out a risk or male sensitization component to this question. That said, I'll present some diagrams and some data in the next couple of minutes that I hope will illustrate that approaching this question from the angle of protection is a valid and useful way to address the issue. I'd also like to make one last point at this point, which is that to address the question of why do we care? Why is it important for us to understand these sex differential risk or protection mechanisms? And there are two main reasons for this. One is that given how consistent this male bias and prevalence is across studies, time, place, if we could understand what is responsible for that skew, we'd wind up learning something really fundamental about autism biology at large. The second reason is that there's great potential here for therapeutics development or development of treatment. If we can design a drug that nullifies risk factors, that could be useful. If we can design a treatment that mimics or boosts up the effects of protective factors, that would also be useful for patients and their families. All right, so I'd like to dig into this in a little bit more detail by presenting you with what we call a liability model for autism. So this is a normal distribution or a bell curve, and we think this curve describes people's exposure in the population to risk factors that are associated with autism. So if we could measure everyone's risk exposure for autism in this room, we'd expect the majority of people to have experienced a moderate or average level of risk. You'd fall right in the middle near that vertical line. We'd expect a small number of people to have experienced very little risk and a small number of people to have experienced a relatively high level of risk. And this slide may look familiar to the one that Wendy showed earlier. We then think that there is a threshold or a minimum level of risk exposure beyond which individuals present with symptoms that garner an autism diagnosis. Now, of course, what we actually think is going on is that males and females have different thresholds or different minimum levels of risk required to show autism. Specifically, we think that females are able to withstand a higher level of risk before they begin to present with symptoms of autism. Now, this is a model. We can make some predictions from this model and test them to see if this really is an accurate way of describing what's going on in the real world. And to do that, we'll zoom in on the top part of the distribution here. So the first prediction is that we think that females can tolerate, or females are protected from, a higher level of risk than males are. Specifically, we think that there is a certain level of risk, or risk exposure, highlighted in the light gray here, that is sufficient to cause autism in males, but not in females, that females are protected from risk in this range. And it turns out that this prediction is really difficult to test because it requires that you go out into the population, find females who do not have an autism diagnosis, have not come to the attention of a clinician, for all intents and purposes, look to be functioning in the world just fine, and yet who have experienced or been exposed to the same level of risk that is sufficient to cause autism in some males. That's really hard to do, but the Autism Sisters Project is a great example of a really clever way to try to find some individuals who do fall in this range. And like we've heard, that's an ongoing project, but I really look forward to the data that will eventually come out of it, and so we can see if this prediction really does hold up. The second prediction is that females with autism have a greater burden of risk factors than males. So if you look at a group of individuals who have autism diagnoses, who presumably have passed these respective risk exposure thresholds, then you would expect that the girls in that group, although they're a smaller number, would have a greater level of liability than the males do on average, because they're clustering at that very, very top of the distribution. Now, this is a lot easier to test because it's much easier to find individuals who have autism diagnoses and then compare the males and females within that group. And I've been talking about risk and liability in somewhat vague terms intentionally so far, but I'll make it more concrete here to mention that the aspect of risk or liability that we understand the best currently is genetic risk for autism. So we can use genetic risk to test this prediction. So if we look at individuals who have autism, we can compare genetic risk in the males and females and see if this prediction bears out. And as Wendy alluded to earlier, it does, in fact. So when we look at autistic cases in this study sample, and we look at 3 independent types of genetic variation that are disruptive in the genome and that are associated with autism risk: copy number variants, insertion deletions, single nucleotide variants. In every case, we see that the incidence of these types of disruptive mutations is more frequent in the girls in this case, in this study sample, than in the males. The red bars are always higher than the blue in this case. So this suggests that our prediction is correct, that the model that we are using, that liability model and distribution, is an accurate way of thinking about the world. And so the next question, the logical question that we would ask is, well, if this is a true effect, what is responsible for it? What is protecting females from lower levels of risk? And the answer is that we don't really know yet, unfortunately. This is an active area of research. But here's one approach that we are taking as a field to try to get a handle on what might be responsible. And it's a two-armed approach. On the one hand, we are working to understand sex differences in neurobiology. What differs between the typical male and female brain in terms of brain morphology, brain function, gene expression, and the effects of sex steroid hormones, so that's testosterone, estrogen. And then on the other hand, there's a lot of work going on to characterize autism neurobiology. So what does the brain look like and behave like in autistic individuals? What is gene expression like in the autistic brain? And then the goal would be to see where these two aspects of neurobiology intersect. Where do they overlap? We would hope that this overlap would be key in telling us which pathways and which processes are most important for modulating risk in a sexually dimorphic way. To make this a bit more concrete, I'll give you an example of the study that I'm working on right now in Stefan Sanders' lab at UCSF that's funded by the Autism Science Foundation Fellowship, where we're looking at sex differences in gene expression. So we're looking for genes that are turned on in males and off in females, or turned on in females and off in males, and then trying to see if those genes overlap with genes that we know are involved in autism. So for example, genes that have mutations in autistic patients. And we would hope that, like I mentioned previously, that these two aspects of biology will converge in specific and informative ways. And this is preliminary, but what we're seeing so far is that genes that have higher expression levels in males compared with females overlap with genes that function in two cell types called microglia and astrocytes. These are non-neuronal cells in the brain that, interestingly enough, show some dysregulation and unusual function in autistic brains. So there's some level of convergence here, and we're following up to see where this takes us. And with that, I'll summarize. So the female protective effect refers to this hypothesis we have that females are able to withstand a higher level of risk exposure than males are, and we think that's due to protective factors potentially operating in females in general. We think it exists because when we look at individuals who have diagnoses of autism, we see that females have a higher level of genetic risk than males do on average, suggesting that those individuals did have to pass that higher threshold of risk in order to make it into our study and to have an autism diagnosis. We think this is really important to understand because it will teach us something about basic autism biology, and there's also potential here for treatments and therapeutics that we hope will be useful to patients and families trying to manage symptoms. What causes it? Well, like I mentioned, we don't know right now, but our working hypothesis is that there's some interaction between autism risk factors and typical sex differences in biology, and we hope that will lead us to a pathway that we can understand and eventually target for therapeutics. So with that, I'd like to again thank the Autism Science Foundation for having me, my mentors at UCSF, and thank you all for your attention.